Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
Hi, I'm Tyler, founder of Cozy Earth. When you're thinking about the perfect gift, what better way to show your loved ones that you care than by giving them something that helps them feel better, sleep better, and add superior luxury to their everyday life? If you sleep in our sheets for 100 nights and don't absolutely love your experience, we'll refund your money. No questions asked. This year, give the gift of Cozy Earth. Once they try it, they'll never go back.
Use code Spotify at CozyEarth.com and save up to 40%. That's CozyEarth.com/Spotify.
As the riflemen climbed higher, they grew fewer, until only a handful of men still climbed in the lead squads. These were the pick of the bunch, the few men who would go forward no matter what was ahead. They were the bone structure of a fighting outfit. They clawed and clubbed and stabbed their way up. The rest of us watched.
We're not a regiment. We're the survivors of a regiment. That, of course, is an anonymous Marine from the 1st Marine Regiment upon leaving the line.
We were no longer even human beings. That's another anonymous Marine, the 1st Marine Regiment.
I don't know where that guy comes from in America, but I'd be interested to investigate.
If only I knew. He's anonymous. He didn't tell us.
He's anonymous.
Yeah, exactly.
So my quote was from Russell Davis, who wrote a fascinating book called Marine at War, a memoir. And he was in the 1st Marine Regiment. It's this obscure little memoir published probably in the 50s or 60s, but it's really interesting.
Welcome, everybody, to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA, where, again, we are talking about the Battle of Peleliu, Part 2. And I'm sure if you remember that by the end of Part 1, we were all on a proper downer.
And we're looking to cheer ourselves up in
We're
episode
looking to
2.
cheer ourselves up.
In any way possible.
An eventual victory. I mean, that's a spoiler. But, in the end, it was always heading that way. But this is... I mean, the thing that characterized our last chat was really how there's only one way for this to go, isn't it? And that's for it to descend into a meat grinder. The Japanese are completely determined to die trying, not even win or die trying, just die trying. The mindset is very peculiar. And then we've had some questionable decision-making as well throughout. So we only covered the first sort of fortnight, didn't we, last time?
If that. I mean, we covered maybe a little over a week in which basically the 1st Marine Regiment is destroyed. And so Davis is sort of telling us what that looks like in a way as he's watching these guys who grow fewer and fewer in number going up those craggy ridges we discussed last time of what's called the Brogal, and the network of Japanese defenses and caves in there. And it's just fewer and fewer people carrying the fight who will continue to go forward, or at least able to, I guess.
But it's only 8 days, isn't it, that they're on the island, the 1st Marine Regiment. And yet in that time, they're sort of 56% down.
Yeah, which is, in a way, is an underestimate. It doesn't even show you how bad it is in the rifle companies, which are, of course, suffering most of the casualties. So in most of the rifle companies, it's 75% and upward. And they're culling out anybody else they can to throw into the mix. And so it's the sort of quintessential example of how bad Peleliu was, because the 1st Marine Regiment goes in over strength, as Marine combat units tend to be during a major invasion. And then within that 8 days, it might as well be 80 days in a sense. It's like World War I trench meat grinder kind of stuff where pretty much everybody's hit.
I still think there isn't sort of somehow an ongoing perception that it doesn't matter how bad it was in World War II. It's not quite as bad as the Western Front in the First World War. And I really hope over the last, this year's worth of podcasts, we're disabusing people of that fact, because that isn't the case at all. I mean, 70+% losses in your fighting capability. I mean, that's almost sort of German level losses at Casino. And that's a byword for kind of just real mismanagement, frankly. I mean, what today, anything less than 30%, you'd be thinking you're combat ineffective, wouldn't you? And rightly so.
Absolutely. And so, you put it on the other side, you invert that 70%. I mean, my gosh, just imagine that. And Jim, I think that's a great point, because it also leads us to the reality that World War II often was a terrible meat grinder like that, including, of course, famously on the Western Front in 44 and 45 too, and in Italy, as you know so well, Jim, too. But also, that Allied victory is not necessarily inevitable in a way, that combat manpower is at a premium, even though we do have the advantage and the probabilities on our side. And as we've talked about so many times, the logistics and all that. I mean, how many guys are we going to get to go forward like this, like Davis was talking about? That's a diminishing asset. That's very, very difficult thing to put your finger on, but it's there. And when you see a unit like the 1st Marine Regiment, which I would argue is among the finest combat regiments that we have in the armed forces at that point in time, when you see them destroyed in 8 days, can we recover that and reconstitute that? And if so, how long is it going to take? It's not until Okinawa that they can get back in the game on any level. And that's September 23rd when they're lifted from the line. Okinawa is April 1st. That's a heck of a long time, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the distance from the beach up to the Omobrogol is only a couple of kilometers as well, isn't it? So we're talking about, intense, close, the combat aside, but the size of the battlefield from where they've landed up to the heights is no distance at all. That's the other thing to remember. These are tiny spaces that this is going on in, that entire regiments are being written down.
Yeah, and also I think we should sort of paint a picture of what we're talking about here. I mean, we're talking about jungle on the low levels, lots of vegetation, albeit vegetation has been smashed by the war. You've got a airstrip, which is just, and a building, which has just been littered with chaos and detritus of war. And then as you push on up the Omobrogol, then it's basically exposed coral. I mean, there isn't really any soil. There's nowhere to hide, really. Again, we've talked a lot about, when we talk about Italy, about the exaggerated blast effect when you're on stone or very thin soil. That's absolutely the case here. And coral, of course, can be incredibly hard. So when it splinters, it's incredibly jagged and lethal, making the shell fire and mortar fire even worse. It's swelteringly hot. There's lots of insects. It's very easy for even the slightest wound, pustule, whatever, to go septic and go bad. Keeping any sense of keeping yourself clean is just impossible. If you've got to defecate, there's not really many places you can go. You can't bury it, really, because...
Can't bury anything.
So that's the stench of, the heat of the dead and the defecation and the sweat and everything. I mean, the whole place must have just stunk to high heaven.
Oh, it had to be awful.
It is a picture of hell. I mean, there's awful fighting and there's awful fighting. And this is about as bad as it's going to be, isn't it?
This is hell on earth. I mean, we did our series on Hurtgen, and that was obviously terrible. And the tree bursts were a problem and all that. I would argue maybe the coral bursts are worse, in part because we can't dig in here.
Yeah.
The soil is such we can't get in. And also on the Omobrogol, those ridge lines, they're hard to just walk over, much less fight over. And so keeping your footing is a real problem. So imagine that in addition to everything else. I mean, I don't know how they gained any ground. It's, and to Al's point, it's perilously close to that airfield, which is why, we have the idea that we've got to take it, because the concern is if the Japanese are looking down the barrel of their guns at the airfield, that they'll be able to just negate anything that happens there. Similar to Guadalcanal, I suppose, is the concern. Yeah. How when the Japanese control Mount Austin and whatnot, it makes Henderson Field a little bit problematic at times. We're worried about that at Peleliu, which is a valid concern, but it perhaps goes a little too far, in having to take every inch of this island. I mean, in those kind of circumstances. So they pull out the 1st Marine Regiment on the September 23rd, but the rest of the division, 5th and 7th Marines, stay in place in addition to their artillery and all that. But they bring in, finally, we had left off, I think, talking about how Geiger overrules Rupertus.
Yeah.
And they bring in 2 regiments from the 81st Division. From the U.S. Army, the 321st and the 323rd. They're a little bit different socially than the Marines, who tend to be very young, 19, 20, 21 or whatever, volunteers. Now, the majority of the 81st Division guys are volunteers in the reserves or just randomly assigned there or whatever, but they're older. They tend to be in their late 20s, about a decade or so older. That is a big difference in combat. So they are stunned at what the Marines look like.
Can you just explain to me why that is significant, John?
So, I mean, as we know, combat is a young person's game. And, to be even 20 years old sometimes can be old, in some respects. But the physicality of it, also the mindset of invulnerability that guys have when they're around that age, you simply have to have that in order to get people to go forward and whatever. The naivete, the impressionability. When you're a little older in your late 20s, maybe you're married by then, maybe you have kids, you've had some life experience, and maybe you're not as much a daredevil. And really, that does matter. So you're still young, especially by our standards, as older guys now. These are young people, of course, but, 28 is different than 19. And so a lot of these Wildcats, that's their nickname, are in that sort of age range. Now, there's plenty of young guys, too, don't get me wrong, especially in the rifle companies. But the 81st tend to skew older. And one of the great impressions they have when they get to Peleliu is just how they can tell these Marines are very young, but they look a lot older. And, and that's just from the fighting they've been through for the next, for that first week or so.
Yeah.
And they're kind of stunned. They look at it and they think, oh, my God, what have we gotten into? Is a very deep sense of foreboding as these rifle companies, take their place in the line. And in one instance, the colonel of the 321st, a guy named Colonel Robert Dark, he's absolutely shocked at how far forward Chesty Puller's command post was, because in the Army, you just simply wouldn't put your command post so far forward that it's basically like a company command post on some levels. And so he has this circular conversation with Puller. It's like, wait, so your command post, I want to know where that is. And Puller's finally like, it's right here, right here, far forward. And Dark is like, wow, this dude is just out there.
Yeah.
He thought it should have been about 1,000 yards back.
But does he think he's nuts?
Yeah, he does. He thinks it's absolutely nuts. And from Puller's standpoint, he's like, well, this is just the way we operate. And Puller, we know how valorous he is. And it doesn't make Dark not valorous. It means they go about it differently.
Yeah.
Dark's view is you've got to have some cohesiveness to your regimental command post, and you can't be right up with the front fighting.
Huh.
Puller's view is you got to be right up front all the time to see precisely what's going on. And it's odd because Puller's so far forward, and yet he doesn't seem to grasp quite what's going on as he just throws his regiment against this, like eggs on a wall in a way, against the Umar Brogal. Puller, of course, by then is completely exhausted.
Yeah.
He's had a wound that hasn't healed in one of his legs. Right. He's been through it here massively.
Which isn't very much the nature of the bad hygiene on the island and the conditions and the climate and all the rest of it. Any sore's going to get worse, all that kind of thing.
So what then do the 81st achieve, though?
Well, you have a little tension at first because they're given some of these crazy frontal attack orders, and because they're under the operational control of the 1st Marine Division under Rip Paradis.
Right.
And so the MO is, all right, let's just send people forward to capture the Umar Brogal, cave by cave, ridge by ridge, whatever it is. But I think it's K Company 321st is just simply not down with that. Their officers are like, we're not sending our people forward to be slaughtered this way. And there's officers who are relieved over this, and the company fails in its objectives. The 7th Marine Regiment, some of them have to come in and deal with this. And so you end up with some Army-Marine tension initially. Mm-hmm. And I think Rip Paradis' reaction is just classic. He's like, there, see, that's what I told you. These are the pussycats, not the wildcats, and he's like, that's why I didn't want him here in the first place. And it's like, dude, lighten up, come on now. So so the Marines, some of them who were inclined to be this way, made a lot over that for generations. I mean, I knew some of these guys who were like, it got so much worse for us when the Army came in because they screwed up this, and actually, when you look at it as an historian, it's such an outlier because for the most part, when those two regiments come in, they improve the situation immeasurably, and they gain ground, and the two sides fight together very well. It's this moment of tension with one company for one really difficult objective.
Yep.
But that's the culture Rip Paradis had created in his division, unfortunately, to where some people were going to seize on that. Overall, I'll tell you, those two regiments of Wildcats go in and fight like wildcats because they have to survive.
Right.
And they don't fight much different than the Marines. I mean, it's very similar.
Well, yes, because the terrain is what it is. What can you do differently? It's not like you can outflank anything, is it? I mean, it's not possible, is it? You're going to have to try and crack the nut the same way, right?
Pretty much, yeah. And of course, the one thing that the 81st has a little bit more artillery than the Marines, and so they can make use of that somewhat. Now, the Marines had already been disassembling, especially some of their 75 millimeter pieces, and sometimes through pulleys and whatnot, had moved them up to have point blank shots at caves. But this is also becoming something of an engineer's war too, in that, you're dealing with caves. So to have people with satchel charges, to have, flames, to fire the caves with gasoline and light them up. And then if you can get tanks anywhere in this mess, which the Americans do, depending on where we're talking about, and self-propelled guns and all that. So the Army's usually has a little bit more firepower to bring to bear. And so, the 81st will have some advantages. About the only thing they do much different than the Marines as things unfold is it's kind of odd, but they're going to fill up sandbags and then sometimes literally physically push them forward as they attack, like crawl forward with sandbags in front of them in order to try and protect themselves from machine gun fire and other firepower. It's very odd and very ponderous, as you might imagine, but that's one little difference. But for the most part, infantry's infantry here, and they're all in the same mess.
Yeah, and at night, because the Japanese are very aggressive at night, aren't they? That's one of the things they're prepared to be.
Yeah, the infiltrators.
Yeah, their mindset is defensive during the day, but at night they're trying to stir the Americans up. So you do get people infiltrating, right? Yeah,
that goes on all night. It's something that's happened in the Pacific War, and I think this is one of the weaknesses the Americans have, is they've tended to cede nighttime to their enemies, both Europe and Pacific. And in the Pacific, the Japanese are much bigger on night infiltration than are the Germans typically. So they're going to send people out there individually. In some cases, though, I should point out too, the Japanese are parties that are emerging from the caves are looking for water. Or food, or so they're out there scrounging around for that out of desperation, not always to attack the Americans, but some of them, of course, are trying to sow terror among the Americans, or they're doing their whole suicide attack thing here and there. But it's something you'd have to worry about pretty much all night long. So you're not really in a foxhole per se. You're kind of in a kind of coral enclosure, maybe I'll put it that way, where you stacked up, if you're lucky, you stacked up these rocks or whatever around yourself. And the other thing too is there's vegetation out there, and Jim mentioned insects and other natural wildlife that's moving around out there too. And you can imagine how quickly in your mind you would think, oh gosh, that's a Japanese infiltrator coming for me. So sleep deprivation, we've discussed that before. I think that's a big part of the mix here. And so it's just, there's no break. The tension, the fear is going on 24/7.
And you just can't get forward because they're in their honeycomb network of tunnels and caves and stuff in the Umabrogel. You just can't get close. Is that the problem? So just days after days, nothing's happening. No ground is being taken. Because I suppose the question is, if by the beginning of October, so 2 weeks in, you've reduced the Japanese to 900 yards by 400 yards, then why the heck can't you just see the whole thing off? And but they don't.
They don't.
This goes on until November. So what the heck's going on here?
Well, this is only my opinion. This is a kind of an American cultural weakness in a way of, okay, well, we've come to this island. It's a small island, and we have to take every bit of it, and we've got to annihilate every last Japanese, and that equates to victory. And the battle won't be over. We won't be victorious until that happens. So earlier in this war, a couple months earlier, the Japanese cultural weakness had led them into a disastrous move in the Battle of Guam. When after the Americans invaded and they had set up their beachhead, the Japanese decided, honor dictates that we have to attack and annihilate that beachhead. And that was part of their culture. And they're playing right into American hands there because they're just slaughtering you with their firepower. And one of the reasons why the Americans win at Guam is they basically eliminate most of the effective Japanese combat manpower within that first 2 weeks because of that. In this case, we've flipped the tables here. The Japanese are using our own cultural predilections against us of, tidying up the battlefield, seeing it through, totally grabbing an objective, whatever it be. Now, on Bougainville, we understand we only want part of this mess of an island. We're not going to where they are, elsewhere way across the jungle. But a smaller island like Peleliu and Angar, as we saw too, we've convinced ourselves we've got to have every last inch of this place. And in the case of Peleliu, we're concerned initially with them being able to menace the airfield. But, by October, I don't think that's really in the cards anymore for the Japanese. And they've lost a lot of their guns at this point, their heavier guns and whatnot. I think you're better off taking your chances with that rather than sending people up there and everything this means.
Well, quite, because they can't. But also, the Japanese aren't going to be resupplied. So, what they've got is what they've got.
They aren't. They're done.
They're done. So why don't you just pull back, go on the defensive, and sit it out? That's
what I personally think they should have done. But I think it also comes from this idea of completeness, of completely taking an objective, completely eliminating that equates to victory.
Yeah, but you'd still do that by the middle of November, whether you're attacking or not.
You absolutely could.
Because they're going to run out of food, aren't they? They just are.
Yeah, we're often not patient enough for that.
Then you could pull a whole load of people off the island, save a huge number of lives. This is incredible quote, isn't there?
It's incredible.
Utter emptiness created a hole in my soul as though life no longer had any meaning, says Sergeant Francis Heatley of the 321st Infantry. Crikey. These are people that are just, they're rock bottom, aren't they?
It's awful. And the rest of the 1st Marine Division is just worn down to the nubs, too, including famously, of course, the 5th Marine Regiment, of which Gene Sledge is a part. He's in this until, I think, mid-October or a little bit beyond. That month, that might as well be years on some levels, and so,
yeah.
But also, I think we tend to forget that it's really, in terms of days logged in combat on the Peleliu, the 81st Division either fights as many or more than the 1st Marine Division.
Yep.
The 81st has to see this thing through to completion, which they are really the sole group doing that by the end of October.
Yeah.
And like Heatley said, that's what this means to him. They're in this pocket, this 400-yard, 900-yard pocket that's getting smaller by the day. Why do we need to do this? It's crazy.
But I suppose if you've got people like Rupertus in charge, that attitude, push, super vigorous victory, you're not going to sit back, shorten your lines and wait for the Japanese to starve, are you? You're just not going to do it.
No, and he had said this ought to be a 3-day battle. And once we're a week or two into this, it's certainly not going to be that. So each day he's thinking, okay, this will be the day. This will be the day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I think that General Muller, the division commander of the 81st, has a different attitude of, I'm not going to worry about the timetable. I'm going to worry about completing the job. And of course, that's a little bit of a difference between the maritime nature of the Marines and the littoral nature of the Army, in that the Army, where it's about land operations and however long it takes. Obviously, the Navy can't operate that way because they don't always want their ships staying in the neighborhood and being vulnerable. So the Marines, a little bit of that is rubbed off on the Marines too, that expeditionary type of approach. So maybe that enters into the equation a bit too, but it just doesn't head in a good direction.
Well, we're going to take a very, very quick break for more. We're on a downer again, boys. We will see you in a second.
I'm David McCloskey, former CIA analyst turned spy novelist.
And I'm Gordon Carrera, national security journalist.
And together, we are the hosts of Goalhanger's latest podcast, The Rest is Classified.
Every week, we're going to bring you brilliant stories from the world of espionage.
We are going to have hilarious characters, real deal, authentic spycraft and intelligence operations, and the often insanely absurd events that fill this world of secrecy and deception.
Think the rest is history, but with spies.
And we're going to start in Iran. The Americans and the Brits, yes, even the Brits, Gordon, doing downright dirty things to destabilize a government.
The CIA love a coup, don't they, David?
We don't love a coup as much as you think we do, Gordon, but when we get around to it, we make sure that it's a banger. And this one, I think, set the template.
Regime change in Iran, all started by a single American spy. Come and join us. The Rest is Classified. Listen at the end of this episode.
Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, USA. We're talking about the Battle of Peleliu. This is part 2 of our 2 parts. I said just before the break that we're on a downer. Here you go, ladies and gentlemen. Murphy, the regimental mascot dog, was killed, enraging the soldiers. Even the dogs bought it.
Even the dogs got it.
Even the dogs aren't safe here. I mean, how awful is that?
Yeah.
Jeez. Yeah, when Murphy gets killed, it's devastating to many of these guys. They were fighting mad after that. They wanted payback. I mean, Murphy was revered in the division. And
shocking, isn't it? So after October the 18th, 1st Marine Division's withdrawn. And you talked about Sledgehammer's book a moment ago.
Yeah.
He says his takeaway, his final analysis when he leaves Peleliu is 30 days of severe, unrelenting, inhuman emotional and physical stress. Proof that I could trust and depend completely on the Marine on each side of me and on our leadership. It's interesting, he thinks the leadership are okay. Proof that I could use my weapons and equipment efficiently under severe stress, and proof that the critical factor in combat stress is duration of the combat rather than the severity. And he puts his ability to survive it all down to boot camp, down to his training, that the training is the thing that has prepared him, has inoculated him against the consequences of battle. And that having done Peleliu, he can do it again because of this training and preparation. That's a remarkable thing for a man to conclude from this, isn't it?
Yeah, and he gets a little perspective, too, because after the operation, he's having a conversation with one of the Guadalcanal veterans, who I think has also been at Cape Gloucester, too.
Yeah.
And, Sledge is like, well, was that just a normal thing? Was that easier than? And then the guy looked at him like, oh, that was absolutely horrible,
Yeah.
So Sledge, okay, that's what I thought, too. I just wanted to make sure that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, that's, and I think it's a great point, Al, about boot camp. I mean, again, this is partially what makes Marines special, is that more intense introductory training. Yeah, less forgiving and whatnot. Again, this tends to skew younger, of course, for people who can deal with that, especially in the context of large armed forces here in World War II. Sledge had wanted war, and he had gotten it, and he had been prepared for it, at least on that level. Not, you can never be fully prepared, but in the leadership, I think he's talking about primarily like Andy Haldane, his remarkable company commander, and the XO who takes over for him. And it really did have excellent leadership in K Company and any of the other units around them. But of course, Sledge is forever damaged by Peleliu. Remember he says, what is the quote? Something in me died at Peleliu. Yeah. I mean, there, that just gets your attention, doesn't it? It's like, wow.
And interestingly, in that same passage, he quotes Robert Graves. He compares his experience to First World War infantryman's experience. He says, we learned the same stuff they learned. And to actually hear that parallel out loud, given we were talking about it earlier on, is very interesting. So they're withdrawn on the 18th of October, and they've suffered 6,526 casualties.
I mean, that's huge for a single division when you think the kind of, fighting strength is under 10,000. Probably, isn't it? Maybe a bit more in a Marine division. I'm not sure. But I mean, it's something like that, isn't it? It's like 9,500 actual fighting troops.
Yeah, roughly. And think of how they has to be rebuilt. And the Marines can't just say, oh, here's the next parcel of draftees. There's got to be more volunteers, and they've got to go through boot camp, and they've got to be prepared. And so that takes time. So the 1st Marine Division is not back into combat until Okinawa on April 1st, 1945. And they needed every single day that they could. And they'll have a much better commander by then, Pedro de Valle, who's, I think, a terrific division commander. Rupertus is a tragic figure in that he's going to end up rotating home, and while he's home is when he suffers, I think, a heart event.
He dies in sort of March 45, I think, doesn't he?
Yeah, like the early months of 1945, really not long after this. And I'm sure this experience probably didn't help his health at all. The stress of it and all. And I think maybe he had this condition, whatever it was diminishing his ability to think clearly, maybe, and to operate as well as he could have. But it's, again, a kind of a sad cautionary tale. And we'd all agree, I think, that Chesty Puller is one of the most valorous people we've ever talked about. But sometimes valor can be a debit on some levels. When you have somebody who just decides, the next frontal attack can make it happen because we've got courage, and that'll carry the day. I mean, courage versus firepower. We all know what wins.
Yeah. It's not the pep talk you want, is it?
No, it isn't. And it's not going to help our morale, is it? And I don't care how tough you are. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time. You're going to get zapped.
It does seem to be a peculiar thing, particularly of the Marine division, that they have these uninspiring pep talks. I remember I was talking to Dick Jesser the other day. We had him on the podcast a year and a bit ago. He was talking about his time on Iwo Jima. The night before Iwo Jima, he was out on deck on their LST. The company commander said, I want you to look around you, and tomorrow night, half of you are going to be dead.
Oh,
thinking, great,
Yeah. Woo, let's go. Yeah, that sounds wonderful.
I mean, how can it? And I said to Dick, well, that's hardly going to kind of give you a lift. He said, well, that was just the Marine way. And I was thinking, well, it's a rubbish way.
It is. It is. I mean, it's best left unsaid in relation to some things, isn't it?
At least he didn't say the dog was going to die as well.
Yeah, that would have really, they wouldn't have gone in then. I mean, that's where we draw the line, Al. The dog dies. We're not going in.
It's frustrating, though, isn't it, to be, I mean, I think one of the things about this battle, and I kind of feel the same way when I think, at least on San Pietro, the Texans, they achieve what they need to do and they kind of do it and there's a point to it. It's like crossing the Rapido. It doesn't work because there's lots of cock-ups and things don't go very well. And you just feel terribly unsatisfied kind of reading about it and hoping against hope that if you read about it again, it'll have a different outcome. Right. And it's kind of the same with Peleliu, that you just think, what were you thinking? This is September 1944. The end is in sight. It might still be a little way away, but it is in sight. You need to marshal these young men very carefully. There's no need to slaughter them on a bit of dried up coral in the middle of the bloody Pacific. You just don't need to do this. Come on, guys, just think rationally, clearly, move whatever kind of sort of weird divisional unit kind of thing that's going on here and just step back a couple of steps and look at this with a little bit of clarity. And hopefully next time we read about it, it'll be okay. They'll take the airfield and call it quits, or just not even bother in the first place. But of course it never is.
Well, it's one of those times, and as a story, and you wish you had a time machine to go back and just grab collars here and there and say, all right, no, you're not doing this. What are you thinking here? Get a clue.
It is an interesting thing, though, because regimental culture, as such, unit culture, demands the idea that you tell your Marines they're better than anyone else, right?
Yep.
And demands that as a necessary part of the process of training people and inspiring them. But there's no point. You don't have to prove it like this. Like, at what point you can believe it up to a point or invest in it up to a point. There has to be a point at which this idea that you're better than everyone else, to the point where your units are being destroyed, then the idea is not working anymore. It's not a useful idea anymore, right? It's
self-defeating. I've called it the fatal weaknesses of strong men. I mean, that's exactly what it is. And I think Puller is the prime example.
Yeah.
The exact prime example. He's like, all right, my guys are supermen. They can do anything. Well, no, they can't do anything.
Yeah.
They can do a lot. They're amazing guys, but there's some limits to that.
But it's the pointlessness of it, isn't it?
I know.
It's the complete pointlessness of it. I mean,
yeah,
supreme sacrifice, unbelievably courageous kind of acts of bravery, people taking huge hits. The war is riddled with these, but there can be few other places or few other battles where the sacrifice is less required than on Peleliu.
Mm.
Yeah.
Where if you just not bothered in the first place, or if you're going to bother with it, just taking a step back.
Yeah.
So many lives would have been saved.
Yeah.
Use it for a good purpose.
Because the bottom line is those Japanese troops are going nowhere. I mean, at the end of the battle, when final resistance collapsed on the 27th of November, there's over 11,000 Japanese dead at Peleliu. But they're going to be dead whether you've flame-thrown them, blasted them, whatever, because they're going to starve.
Yep.
And it's sort of 300 prisoners, isn't it? So,
most of those guys are laborers. It's very few infantry prisoners from Nakagawa's regiment. He, of course, burns the colors and
commits seppuku and all that.
It's the same old thing there. And so the 81st fights for 5 weeks or so to end this battle. And that's the part that I wish was in our popular memory more. Is it's always the Marines at Peleliu, the Marines this, the Marines that, and obviously they're a huge part of this. But the 81st is every bit as embedded in this story as well. And they actually, as I said, probably fight more days there.
Yeah.
Seeing this through. And the other interesting wrinkle, too, from our 21st century standpoint, the 81st Division encounters what I would term are basically like IEDs in some of the really difficult terrain toward the end. It is incredibly similar to what insurgents of the 21st century do in terms of like wiring up ordnance and using it for that purpose. I mean, in World War II sense, we'll call it booby traps, but it's like an IED.
Yeah.
And in one case, like an entire squad is basically destroyed. And these guys had known each other for years, had trained together and now fought together. And they saw, just how, dismembered some of them were and how some of them, are living their last moments. And, so, I mean, we fixate on September when the invasion happens and how bad that was. But this was still horrible to the end for the 81st Division, encountering that kind of resistance to snuff it out. That's what it took.
The Allies have all the advantages that the war's weighted in their favour on a blank sheet of paper. And the other thing, this is completely different to Northwest Europe, isn't it? Germans do surrender in the end. Some of them kill themselves, but you don't have this absolute last round thing that the Japanese are doing, do you? There's a point where they go, actually, you know what? We're done here. We're fine. It's all right. I suppose if you're Japanese here, your back is to the wall. There is nowhere to go. But, surrender.
But the cultural expectation is you will fight to the end, and that it's dishonorable not to do so. And also the strategy is such that you should be doing that because you're supposed to inflict damage on the Americans as much as possible, and that will help Japan, which there's a great deal of truth to that, I think. And of course, remember too, these are really good combat soldiers on their side, Nakagawa's people. Yeah, that's a first-rate regiment. And they've been trained well, and they are willing to fight. They know one another well, and obviously that matters too.
I mean, let's not forget. I mean, it's just as wasteful from the Japanese perspective. I mean, and pointless and kind of unnecessary and ridiculous.
It really is. It's so sad.
And even once the Americans have got the island, it doesn't really, it's like, so what?
I know. So the Marines suffer about 6,500 casualties. The 81st Division suffers 2,500, but 79% of them were infantrymen of the killed and wounded. So that told you who was sacrificing. Those rifle companies in the 321st, the 323rd, they end up just fighting there along the crags of that Japanese pocket. There's all these nicknames that the Americans have for the various battlefields. Old Baldy, Five Sisters, the China Wall, Walt Ridge, the Wildcat Bowl. And we know where that comes from. I mean, the Wildcat Bowl, Rupertus probably didn't want that, but that's what it'll be nicknamed. And all these places are, there to this day as these horrifying kind of museum pieces to what happened in 1944 in this awful place. It's
wow. Well, in the new year we'll be moving on to the Philippines, so okay.
That'll be much more upbeat.
Cheer ourselves up.
The scope of that'll be much larger. I mean, these are enormous operations, and and of course they're almost all Army, and so it's a completely different thing administratively.
I just think the Philippines battle is. I mean, I think Peleliu is very interesting in a morbid, sort of grim way, but Philippines definitely is. But we should end with Eugene Sledge, don't you think?
I think we should. He says, "Something in me died at Peleliu. Perhaps it was the childish innocence that accepted as faith the claim that man is basically good. Possibly I lost faith that politicians in high places who do not have to endure war's savagery will ever stop blundering and sending others to endure it." Boy, if that isn't true, I mean, think about that. That quote has aged well, I think, in the 80 years since. And of course, we all know Dr. Sledge's son, Henry, who is going to be publishing a book of his own next year. Quite interesting because for everything that's in with the old breed, there's about 60% more that never made the cut. And so there's a little bit more to explore there, including Henry's own recollections too.
Well, I thought it's fascinating. I've just read it. I thought it was great. It's really, really interesting, and he's done a really, really good job on that. We've also got my great friend Aaron Young's book on Peleliu coming out at some point, and he's been writing a lot about that and doing a lot on the Japanese. So I think when those two books come out, it might be worth revisiting it and looking at it from a kind of a fresh perspective.
I think so, because and especially like you said, the Japanese perspective too. The more that we can get at that, the better, because their role in these battles sometimes is anonymous because almost all of them died. And it's very difficult to pinpoint there. And I don't know of too many instances where the Americans captured diaries at Peleliu. They did in other places, which really sheds light on the Japanese perspective, especially in New Guinea. Not as much here, because this really was a snuff out kind of thing. And, in terms of what Peleliu contributes in the subsequent wars, not much. One small thing is that, when the Indianapolis goes down in the summer of 1945, some planes flying from Peleliu do find a few of the survivors. Right. But other than that, we don't get much.
It has no role in the war beyond that.
Not much. I mean, it really is a tertiary kind of airfield, and the historical consensus is it really didn't need to be taken. And that only adds to the tragedy of this whole thing. And of course, we end up invading at Leyte, not Mindanao, in the fall of 44, in October, even as the Peleliu fight is going on. Of course, we've invaded Leyte on October 20th. And so, Halsey was right, I think, in retrospect, to urge that we should call this off. It's really quite sad. And Nimitz never addressed this the rest of his life. He was not a big postmortem kind of guy anyway. He didn't write memoirs. He felt that was self-serving, and he didn't want to say anything bad about anybody else. He had such contempt for that, but he never quite explained himself as to why he, went ahead with this. And MacArthur never really addressed it either. I guess he didn't want to touch that radioactive beast. Yeah. And so it ends up in this sort of netherworld of our historiography, I guess. It's very well known, of course, especially for the Marine point of view. But I think maybe in this larger kind of command context, there's a lot that's unsaid or unexplored or unknown. Probably will always be that, I think, unfortunately.
Well, thanks, John.
Yes, thanks, John, for taking us through that.
Amazing.
Yes, and it is that bizarre business of it coming to nothing in the end. I mean, how you swallow that as a soldier or a Marine who's lost his pals and seen his units torn to pieces and your friends killed around you. It must be very, very difficult to then go, and then we didn't use it for anything.
That's the horrible part. But, I think it's the one way that maybe a World War II veteran could relate to some of the guys who fight in later wars, especially Vietnam, similar valor for just incredible things that they accomplish, say hanging on to Quezon in 1968 or something, only to give it up. That maybe you could relate in a way of saying, yeah, I know what it's like to fight so hard and lose some of my best friends for something that in the end didn't bear the fruit that we would have wanted. And I think in that sense, it maybe Peleliu is a little bit of a harbinger for some of our subsequent battles, even lasting into the 21st century. Yep. That you could relate on some level. And I think maybe that's what Sledge is talking about when he talks about, sort of that losing faith somewhat, that all this will lead to some higher purpose, and that there are people above you who know what they're doing and can, and and that's not always true, of course, is it? And man is basically good. Well, how could you come away believing that after experiencing something like Peleliu, much less later Okinawa, which arguably is even worse for Sledge and the others who fight there? I mean, wow, it gives you a lot to chew on mentally, I think. And
it certainly does.
I think Dr. Sledge dealt with that much of the rest of his life, and yet emerged on the other side as such a fundamentally decent person who did so much good in the world. It's an amazing guy.
Well, that was certainly the what Dick Jesser was saying, having survived Iwo Jima. He just had his Damascene moment, was when he looked down over the body of a dead Japanese and saw letters and just thought, well, I've got letters too, and suddenly realized there was a commonality rather than a massive difference. And he just suddenly thought, I don't want to be at war anymore, and I don't want to ever go. I'm going to be anti-war the rest of my life, and I also, if I do get home, I want to do some good. And he became a professor of behavioral science at the University of Colorado and stayed there on the staff for 70 years.
70 years. Wow.
Yeah.
He dealt with, I don't know what would have been harder for him, Iwo Jima or dealing with students for 70 years. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I know. But very smart, lovely, amazing guy. I mean, just incredible.
Yeah, an amazing guy. Wow.
Well, thanks, John. That was a fascinating chat. And thanks also, Jim. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We will see you again on We Have Ways USA very soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.
See ya.
Hi, it's David McCloskey from The Rest is Classified. Here's that clip that we mentioned earlier on. We're back with Kermit Roosevelt. We're in Tehran in July of 1953. Kermit is there. He is planning a coup. He's got bags of cash, and he's ensconced in a villa, calling himself James Lockridge.
That's right. And he's supposed to be undercover as James Lockridge, but he plays tennis with other expats and diplomats. And every time he misses a shot, he curses himself and says, "Oh, Roosevelt," which is his real name. So it's not. And then when people ask why, he goes, "Well, I'm such a passionate Republican that I hate Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat. And so I use the name as a curse word." I mean, that's not good cover, is it, David?
It's pretty rough. It's pretty rough. Although I will say that being wasted on lime rickeys and playing tennis, that's just a normal CIA operation.
Is that what you did in the Middle East?
Yeah, exactly.
Can you confirm that?
This seems very normal. So Kermit's there. Now, he's brought
money.
Yeah.
Is that right? To kind
Yeah.
of throw around. But it's maybe less than we would think
Yeah.
to accomplish the overthrow of a government. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, some of the estimates said that he can do it for $100,000, something like that. I mean, it seems crazy, doesn't it, to think that's all it costs for the coup. I mean, the estimates vary, but that's basically bribe money.
That's right.
That he's got.
I thought this was also very interesting. I was not aware of this before we started to dig in, that he actually takes over MI6's networks in Iran, doesn't he? Which is, I actually can't think of a modern parallel where you don't have a joint. I mean, it's a joint effort, but he doesn't have Brits on the ground with him.
Yeah.
He's there. He's taken over
the British network.
The British network.
And if you want to hear the full episode, listen to The Rest is Classified wherever you get your podcasts.